Hi folks, my name is George Chamalis. We're going to be getting started here in a couple seconds, but I want to start with an apology. The initial plan for this presentation was to, as we go through this process, have a live site up online so that we could go through and go back and forth and actually throw attacks against a site. And the idea was secondary to the overall presentation, but it would be kind of a fun thing for people to do because it's a system that's being used in a lot of these conflict zones that we'll be talking about. Unfortunately, a couple of days ago, I was looking through the latest code base, and we were going to be using one of the pre-releases, and I found that amongst the really awesome features that this particular group has added to the most recent version of their code is the ability to add JavaScript to arbitrary pages from the admin interface. So which is kind of cool from a security perspective. It's like a server-side, client-side JavaScript injection. But when I really started thinking about the number of ways that could go wrong, I decided it wasn't worth running that particular instance. So instead, what we've got is at roguegenius.com/bh.html. There's an Amazon Web Services AMI that's set up, and there's also a download to a VM image if you would like to download that, and then you can, server-side, client-side JavaScript inject yourself to your heart's content. Fortunately, it was just secondary to the overall presentation. We were just going to be running through it just for fun. So to get started, again, my name is George Chamalis. I'd like to get a quick check for the audience before we really get in here. So could I get a show of hands? Who here is male? Really? Not? Okay. So who here is female? Awesome. Welcome. Who here does a web application pen testing? All right. Who here works independently, just independent contractor? One, great. Who here works for a large corporation? Okay. Who here works for the government? Some government folks, great. Who here works for a government that's run by a dictatorial regime, run by terrible people that have terrible human rights records? Good, awesome. I really appreciate that honesty, thank you. So we're going to be talking about your work as we go through this presentation. So I'm here today because the humanitarian technology community needs your help. I've done computer security for about 10 years, working in a combination of US government and private industry. After about 10 years, I decided to go off on my own, started working out in the world, and realized that one of the benefits of working independently is that you can work on whatever you want. And so humanitarian work, crisis response is something that I've always been really interested in, and so there was nothing keeping me out of it, so I jumped in and started doing some work in the space. And what I found was that these groups that are doing these humanitarian response operations are using the same sorts of technologies that we're used to going after, but they're using it in really, really hostile situations when there are some pretty significant consequences. And one of those technologies that I want to talk about today is a new technology that's being used in the field called crisis mapping. The idea behind crisis mapping is pretty simple. In a crisis, you've got response organizations, and these groups are designed to go into the crisis area and deliver aid to the people that are on the ground. And this is the way that it's been done for the history of crisis response by these organizations. But what's different now is that now those people inside of the disaster, inside of the crisis zone, have got cell phones that can put out SMS messages. They've got things like Facebook accounts or Twitter accounts, and they can send out YouTube videos. And this is resulting in a huge amount of information that's coming out of these crisis areas. Now, the big response groups, for the entire history of their existence, they've gone through and they've delivered aid, things like food, water, shelter, medicine. They aren't used to being able to this new internet thing. They're still grappling with the idea of the internet as a whole, let alone trying to use all this information that's coming out to help their operations. So crisis mapping is the process of collecting that open source information, that open source intelligence, processing it from its raw tweet, SMS state, and providing it back to the response organizations in the form of reports that they could then use to provide much more targeted aid to the people inside of these situations. And the technology has been around for a couple of years now, and by far the biggest and most successful deployment that's taken place was in Haiti following the major earthquake that hit last year in January. And I've done some work in Haiti since then, and I can tell you it looks, even now, it looks like a bad dream. It was a city in Port-au-Prince that was made up entirely of unreinforced concrete that was hit by a massive earthquake. And the one good thing that happened in this cataclysmic event is that some folks, through some pretty heroic acts, were able to get the cell phone network back up really, really quickly. And then another group of technologists were able to obtain the SMS short code 4636. And they put the word out to the people in the disaster-affected area to send in text messages about where you are, what do you see. And they started receiving messages from people on the ground. In the first couple of weeks that they were running the platform, they received around 50 to 80,000 SMS messages. And the first challenge they had when they came in is that it came in Haitian Creole, which is similar to French, but it was also coming in, in broken up SMS speak. So one of my colleagues, a guy named Rob Monroe, who works for Stanford, put together a team of about 1,000 members of the Haitian diaspora, people that he collected through Facebook, and set them up on a platform that they built that allows them to translate those messages into English so they can be used by the response organizations. So now we've got these SMS messages. They've gone from Haitian Creole. They're now in English. But then we know that this particular message is somebody who's trapped in a house, but we don't know where they are. I mean, he's got his address there, but there is no Google Street View Port-au-Prince. There's very few geographic reference to address databases. So people had to go through and geolocate things by hand. Now, fortunately, they're dealing with members of the Haitian diaspora. So there were times where people knew these addresses, and they were able to find additional databases and additional people to help out so they could actually geolocate the messages. And then once they had the message geolocated, they knew what the context was, they were able to push that report using GeoRSS over to the response agencies. So they can do things like send out the search and rescue teams. They can send aid to the orphanage that has collapsed. They can send medical help to the woman who is about to give birth. And it was a defining moment in the life of this technology, and an excellent example of how it can be very, very, very useful in a disaster situation. The problem, though, is that natural disasters don't shoot back. And now this same technology that was initially designed to help in large-scale disasters is being used in places where there are hostile groups. There are people that are directly interested in not having them succeed. The first major deployment that I worked on as the tech lead was supporting a team on the ground in Pakistan who were responding to the nationwide flooding that happened in the middle of last year. And things were going relatively smoothly. We had an SMS shortcode that was up online. We had our map. We had a team of volunteers that were geolocating the messages as they were coming in. We were receiving field reports from some of the agencies that were coming in without locations and lat longs associated with them. We were able to geo-reference those and find those locations. And then this happened. So now we're in a position where the Taliban has said that they're going to target foreign aid workers that are invading this country, and we're building a giant map that has got the location of foreign aid workers in their country. So we had to adapt, and we had to realize, okay, these things can go wrong. The next big deployment that I worked on was in Sudan. Sudan has a long history of really, really atrocious things. This picture in particular is believed to be a satellite shot of mass graves in the Kadugli area of Sudan that was caught by a group called the Satellite Sentinel. The deployment in Sudan was being done with a local NGO who was doing vote monitoring for one of the nationwide referendums that was going to decide whether or not the country was split between the natural resource-rich south and the north where the government was. And there was the expectation that there was going to be violence and issues surrounding this election. And during that deployment, we had to deal with a couple of things. We got some obviously faked reports, things that came in saying to the effect of, everything is fine at this polling station and everyone is voting for the ruling party. Stuff that just didn't ring true. We also had to deal with our site getting blocked by the IP address from inside of Sudan, so people weren't able to reach it from the ground. And then we had a really funny moment where we had an inadvertent spam DOS, where a bug in the code that we were using caused the site to crash, and we had to diagnose on the fly. And then the last one, the most recent deployment that I worked on was in Libya during the hostilities that started our deployment started at the beginning of March. And we began the deployment when it was just civil unrest in Libya and ran it as it turned into this, to a full-scale war, complete with the French bombing the country. I mean, who expected the French, right? So The other thing that was strange about the Libya deployment, it was unusual, is that unlike the previous deployments where we were working with people on the ground, we weren't working with any organizations on the ground. And that's because the deployment was requested of a team that we work with by the United Nations. So the UN approached us and said, hey, we have no insight into what is happening in Libya. We have no idea where the aid is needed, where the fighting is worse. Can you guys put something together using your crisis mapping stuff that can give us a sense of what is happening on the ground? And so now we're doing a deployment in an active war zone, and we have a couple of things that we have to deal with. The biggest one is protecting our observers. We're collecting firsthand accounts of people on the ground, so we want to make sure that those people are not going to be targeted as a result of their actions. Next, we had to verify information. We were getting a variety of information that was going to be used by response organizations. So there was a lot of issues and concerns about manipulation and how do we know that something is true. And we did the whole thing using volunteer analysts on the internet, which is itself another big security concern. We have just anybody coming in who's working on this platform. And so when you look at the timeline for this technology, you see the major kind of watershed moment was Haiti, where we had the big Haiti deployment in January of 2010. And now we have Libya, so we've gone from earthquake to war zone in less than 18 months. And this appears to be an increasing trend. There are now active deployments taking place in Syria, Bahrain, and Egypt. The good thing about the growth and the progress of this technology is that the big players, the major groups, are beginning to catch on. This is a tweet from the head of the World Food Program saying, hey, this Libya crisis map thing, that's pretty cool. It's the future of aid response. Very, very useful. The bad side of that is that it's not just the good guys that are catching on. So there's a team in Egypt that's done a number of these types of deployments. And last year, they were approached by the secret police in Egypt who demanded back-end admin access to their system. So we know that the good guys are catching on, and the bad guys are starting to realize that there's something here to work with as well. And so we work in security. We've done this for years. We know how this story plays out. There's a new capability. It gets out there. It's used. People think, oh, wow, that's really, really cool. And then we have attacks. And we have that moment where we go from, ooh, shiny to, oh, shit. And then when that happens, people turn and look at the security people and say, don't just stand there, do something. And we know that this is how it plays out. The schedule for the last 2 days has been filled with technologies that are going into the oh shit type of moment. But we don't want that to happen in this case, because when we're dealing with crisis maps, when we're dealing with people in conflict zones, we have some pretty significant consequences that we have to deal with. In these situations, if a user's identity gets compromised, it's not a matter of them having a cloned credit card or having to change their password. There's a potential that people could be arrested, people could disappear, something bad could happen to them. If a site gets knocked offline, it's not a matter of lost revenue, it's not a black eye to Sony. There's the potential that this is a lifeline for people inside these situations, and that could go away if the site gets knocked out. And finally, the real concern, one of the biggest concerns, is that if a deployment gets compromised, if there are direct negative consequences from a compromise of one of these deployments, then the technology could be abandoned by the major aid organizations. Because remember, these guys are designed to measure their success based on how much food, water, medicine, and shelter they deliver. It's not their job to monitor Twitter. It's not their job to take YouTube videos and figure out what it means and do a better, try to work that into their operations. And if these technologies become labeled as a risk, as a liability, as too dangerous to run, then the easiest path for the large aid agencies is just to not use them. And if that happens, it won't matter that there is all this information out there that can be extremely useful, because there won't be anyone listening. So there are a couple of us who have security backgrounds that are working in this field. And we've started coming up with what are the beginnings of security best practices and standards for doing these types of deployments. The problem is that we're good, but we're not as smart as everyone in this audience. And so the idea behind this presentation is that we want to talk about what's been done so far give you a background on this technology, on where it's been used, on some of the challenges that we've been facing. And then we want to get feedback from you guys on these best practices that we're putting together. The idea here is that I'm a decent web app hacker, but I'm not as good as some of the people in this room. There are people here who have more operational security experience than me. There are people here who are just more devious than I am. And so as we go through and talk about some of these things that can be done, we'd like to get your feedback on things that we've missed, things that you see that we don't see. Because if we do that, then we can catch them at this stage when we're just beginning to talk about them, as opposed to later on down the line when something does go wrong and we go, oops, we missed that. And finally, I want to generate a bit of interest in the security community in this field, because it's really, it can be very satisfying. It's very exciting, and it's a new technology that is really beginning to come into its own in the greater response world. And when thinking about the best way to go about and present this information, we went back and forth kind of what's the best way to present it. We could talk about the vulnerabilities or the attacks, but then realized that the easiest way to walk through it would be to just go through each of the steps that take place in a regular deployment, because they do tend to follow a pretty standard model no matter who it is that's actually doing it and what the situation is. And the kind of fill in the blank Mad Lib style setup is, there's just been a blank in the country of blank. It could be a natural disaster in the country of Bahrain. It could be an earthquake in Haiti. As a team from somewhere, on the ground, NGO, online, we're responsible for deploying a crisis map in order to do something helpful. So when we think about the different options, there's just been a blank. There are a lot of different things that we could talk about. One of the ones that's really been in the news lately is we've got lots of revolutions. So let's talk about revolutions as we go through. The next thing is in the country of blank. And in the original idea is that we'd use this, and then whatever country we picked, we'd set that up in our crisis map. But then when I started going through and thinking about where are all the places that have revolutions, I realized that those places all have active deployments of crisis mapping technology happening in them. And so that got a little bit confusing in terms of where should people be attacking, who are we pretending to be, et cetera. So instead of doing that, we're just going to be doing our simulation in the country of Tarakistan, which is located here-ish, right? And so Tarakistan is, located here. It's got a military rule dictatorship, been in power for about 50 plus years, fairly sophisticated in their ability to intercept communications on the network, on cell phones, online. Huge young population. It's gotten very restless. They're beginning to revolt, and there's the concern that this is going to turn into a full-scale civil war. Now, we could go through the rest of these things, and I could just make the decisions about what we should do and what we shouldn't do, but I'd like to start switching this over and start getting some feedback from the audience, and give you guys the opportunity to decide what path do we want to take as we go through. And it would be fun to have everyone do it just kind of based as, you guys as security professionals, but one of the cool things about being a security person is that you know how to think as both the good guy and the bad guy. And so I'd like to make one half of you guys the bad guys as we go through. And when I say the bad guys, I mean you are the Tarakistani secret police. You are the government. You are the local terrorist cell. You are the local mob group that's taking things for the black market. And I was looking across, I think these people looked more devious. So this section and this section, you're the bad guys. So as we go through, there are going to be decisions. I want you guys to pick the ones that are the least secure, the ones that will give you the highest likelihood of screwing with the good guys. And you guys are the good guys. All of them are trying to screw you over. So when we reach some of these decision points, I'd like you guys to pick the ones that are the most secure, the most defensible, the best idea, based on what you know about security. And so we're going to be doing this using polls. We'll be stopping and say, okay, good guys, bad guys, show of hands. What do you guys think is the best idea for your particular group? In addition to that, I'm going to do a couple more things. I'm also going to go back, and afterwards I want to ask a couple people why they picked a particular option or why they didn't pick a particular option. I'm doing this for a very specific reason. One of the concerns that I have is that as we go back to the crisis mapping community, to the humanitarian community, and begin talking about the standards and best practices in security, the first thing that's going to happen is that we're going to be accused of giving the bad guys ideas. And when that happens, the option is to, the standard approach is to try to explain security through obscurity and how you must assume the attacker knows the system, and that bad guys are thinking about stuff like that. But instead of lecturing them, what I'd like to be able to do is say, hey, I did this presentation in front of a room of security people who knew nothing about this technology when we first started talking. And as we went through, just from what I was saying, they were able to come up with this particular attack, this particular attack, this particular attack, this vulnerability, this vulnerability, this vulnerability. And they were able to come up with that because that's just how we think. And if a random group of people at a conference can come up with it, based on their security background, you can absolutely expect that somebody who is paid to do this by a government, by a military, is going to be able to come up with the same thing because it's not strictly that hard. And as a result, we have to think about the things that can go wrong. We have to talk about this. And then also, there will be points at the end of each section where I'd like people to tell me what we're missing. Because, again, I'm good, I've thought about this, but we need you guys to point out the things that you see that we don't see. So as we go through and I stop to ask people how they decided to pick something, please let me know. And please state something, even if it's just really, really blatantly obvious. If it's kind of like the because duh sort of answer. Because it's because duh sort of answer to you guys, but not to the humanitarian community. And your answers are going to be very helpful in defending this stuff when we go back. Yes? Great idea. We're going to explain that. Great question. The question was, how does a crisis map get deployed in some of these situations? So here we are. There's been a revolution in Tarakistan. The first question is, as a team from blank, who are we when we're deploying this system? And the most important characteristic of somebody for running these systems is that they be on the ground. It's entirely possible to do it online, to just do it collecting the information that's out there. But if you're trying to actually affect change on the ground, if you're trying to actually interact with the response organizations who have not bought into this technology, who are not using it, you have to have someone there in their face explaining its usefulness. And so for our options of who can be using this on the ground, historically this is what we've seen. Either it's an individual, just a group of people, it's a local NGO, some pre-established group of people, a media organization, and for the context of this, let's assume that it's an independent media organization. It's not being run by the state-run media. It's an international NGO, it's one of the big players, or it's a military. So this is the first decision point. So when I ask you guys, as bad guys, as good guys, stop for a second and think, bad guys, who do you want running this platform? Who's going to give you the greatest opportunity to disrupt it, to stop it, to do terrible things to it? And good guys, in this case, who do you want running this? Who do you think has the highest likelihood of being able to do it safely, being able to do it securely, and being able to do it effectively? So by show of hands, who wants it to be an individual? All right. Who wants it to be a local NGO? Who wants it to be an international NGO? Now, this is kind of a cool moment. Keep your hands up. Because normally what you would expect in a typical security situation is that there would be all the bad guys would want one thing and all the good guys would want another thing. This is a situation where they tend to agree. Who wants it to be the military? Outside military. Good question. That's right. So by and large, the good guys want it to be the military or local or international NGO. The bad guys want it to be either an international NGO or a local NGO. So can I get somebody who raised their hand from the bad guys tell me why they picked something? Yes, sir. That's fantastic. So the answer is that he knows somebody who works at the UN and their IT security is god-awful. Great. Somebody else. Sir. Great. So the comment is that the military has the opportunity to actually do it right, actually throw the manpower to do it securely, whereas an international NGO does not. How about somebody from the good side? Tell me what you picked and why. Sir.
I picked local NGO because they would have local presence and local
Absolutely. Local presence and local acceptance for a local NGO.
I was thinking of a local independent media org because they'll have that local presence, but possibly also have an interconnection with the outside world.
Yep. Yeah, so internet or a media organization because they have the presence, they know the people around, and they have the connection to the wider world.
And I picked an international NGO because I figured that anybody else on the ground there was going to come under significant pressure from the local government.
Yep.
And then an international NGO might actually be able to withstand that.
Excellent. So local people are going to come under pressure. International NGO could withstand that pressure. Could I get someone here to tell me why you didn't pick an individual? That's a great point. Individuals could be highly capable and difficult to track. Did somebody over here pick an individual? No one did. Awesome. So what we're seeing when in the actual breakdown, and this is just kind of like an off-the-cuff summarization, is that by and large, these things are being done by individuals. With the next kind of highest one being local NGOs who are beginning to pick up the technology. They can do that because they don't have to go through some big bureaucratic process to decide whether or not they use a particular thing. There's been some testing of this technology by media organizations. Al Jazeera did one in Gaza. The funniest one I've seen was the BBC used it to track sightings of the Pope Mobile when the Pope was in the UK. And they got it not just at like not just at the big parades or the big shows, but like the Pope Mobile just drove through my town. Here's a picture I got. We're seeing some usage and some basic pickup by international NGOs. The Libya crisis map was one. We've done another exercise simulating an earthquake in Colombia with the UN. And there's just the beginnings of work by at least the US military. So there's currently an exercise going on in Central California where a team from the US Navy is using this technology and piloting it. The big concern, and one of the biggest concerns, is that right now there is no standard deployment process. So when you ask me how does one of these things come to be deployed, the answer is it's entirely ad hoc. This is a chat log from one of the crisis mapping groups that I work with that took place right after the Mumbai bomb blasts a couple weeks ago, saying, hey everyone, if you see a deployment related to the Mumbai bomb blast, please share here so we can amplify / send folks to the deployment. Thank you. So the question was not, who are these people, what are they doing, how do we know them? The question was just, is there one of these things online? Let us know so we can help it. And the first problem with that is that launching a platform, the level of effort you need to actually set one of these things up is tiny compared to the amount of effort needed to actually operate it successfully. So remember, in Haiti, it took 1,000 members of the Haitian diaspora. The deployment ran for weeks and weeks and weeks. Similarly in Pakistan. So just deciding who's going to run these things based on who's got the capability to set it up is not the same thing as who's best capable of setting it up. I really like the comment about individuals being highly capable, but the fact of the matter is right now it's entirely ad hoc. It's someone who just knew enough to get it online. And so since we're in a position where we don't know the people who are setting these things up, and the classic model is just to support whoever seems to have the most momentum, we're in a position where we have to kind of build trust with people on the fly. And we've done this a number of different times, and what we're beginning to see emerge is a pattern for ways that we can try to build trust on the fly with people in these situations. The first component of that is corroboration. So this is kind of second-hand trust. Like, I trust this person, they trust you. In Egypt, the team that's been bothered by the secret police, I did some consulting with them. They contacted me for help. I didn't know who they were, but I had a colleague that I worked really closely with who was also consulting with them. She'd been in Egypt, she'd worked with them, she'd talked to them, she trusted them. So she was able to corroborate the story that they were telling me. The next is reputation. The individual who set up the initial deployment in Pakistan was just a guy. Just some guy who knew enough about this to set it up. Now, fortunately, his name was Faisal Chowan. He's a TED fellow. So TED is this international smart persons conference, and they do vetting for people. He was also a tech CEO. Fortunately for our deployment, he also never slept, which was really useful since we were on a 12-hour time difference from him. But there was enough information out there about him, of other groups that trust him, that were able to give us a sense of, okay, maybe this guy is legit. And then finally, there was eventually a crisis map set up for the Mumbai bomb blast that did a little bit of work. And the reason, and in that case, the person who set it up was a guy named AJ, who we had all worked with on the Pakistan deployment. So we had a history with him. So we didn't know him directly. We didn't have any other information, but we'd seen him working before. So we've got this model of corroboration, reputation, and history. But whoever it is that sets it up on the ground, they're going to start having to deal with direct attacks, which is one of the comments that someone made about why they didn't pick an individual. We're dealing in a world where people are arresting bloggers. And when you think about it, this is one person who set up a website to talk about what they see and the things that they don't like. And if you think about crisis maps as one website that's able to take the views and the voices of thousands of people and display it to the world, you can make the case that these people are going to potentially become targets in the same way that bloggers have. And remember, we've already seen the initial pieces of this, where right now the Egyptian security services, or at the time, were politely asking, given what they could have done, for credentials in the system. But we have the potential for this to be someone kicking down a door. So when we think about the direct attacks, yeah, we've got a scale of vulnerability. Individuals and local NGOs are the most vulnerable to attacks, but the larger organizations, international NGOs and the military, they're the most likely to have the capability to deal with those attacks. But we don't have to worry about just direct attacks. We need to worry about indirect attacks, like infiltration. So this is a situation where either someone was already working for the bad guys, or they were compromised during a deployment. Maybe their machine was hacked, maybe they were picked up, maybe they were forced to give up their username and password. But we have to deal with the possibility that the people who were actually in these organizations cannot be trusted. I really, really liked Moxie Marlinspike's comment about trust agility. It's a really excellent concept that you could have to deal with changes in trust on the fly during one of these situations. The best thing we can do about that is isolation of operations. This is similar to the need to know scenario that you have in the classified and government type of world, where you don't need to have everybody in your organization have complete access to the site. But what you see is that if you're dealing with the military, just statistically speaking, you're less concerned, possibly about that group being infiltrated. But the smaller the organization gets, the higher the likelihood that infiltration of that group could lead to a compromise of the system. So for a quick summary of what we're worried about for threats to the deployment managers, to the people on the ground, we've got a couple of things. Ignorance. People don't know what they're getting into. Hopefully standards and best practices will deal with that. Direct attacks. Like you said, anonymity. If people can't find them, that can be useful. And then the bigger, the better you are, the less likely that a direct attack is going to have a significant impact into you. And finally, infiltration. We've got this beginning concept of corroboration, reputation, history, and isolation of operations. So based on that, for a discussion of deployment managers, does anybody see anything here that we're missing? Something that jumps out at you is like, wait a minute, you didn't think about this particular thing. Oh, awesome. All right. So now we're at the point where we know who we are. We're some group that's ideally less likely to be attacked. Now we have to deal with deploying a crisis map. So the question is, what is a crisis map? What does it do? Crisis maps have to do three basic things. They have to collect messages, then they have to process those into some kind of reports, and then they need to present those reports back out. And for actually setting up these crisis maps, you have right now kind of three basic options. The first is you can code it yourself. You can just sit down and just knock it out. The picture on the left there is a deployment that was done to track radiation following the Fukushima from the Fukushima nuclear plant. That was put together by a team of a combination US and Japanese coders. Next, you can kludge it together from existing services. There's various geo-type services that are online. You can connect those with various social media things online. And then third, there's beginning to be the development of open source applications, things that are specifically coded and designed for doing this type of work. So again, asking as bad guys and good guys. Bad guys, what do you want to attack? And good guys, what do you want to defend? Which of these options do you want to go with? So who wants to code it yourself? Who wants to use existing services? And who wants to use open source apps? All right, so most of the good guys want to go with open source apps. Most of the bad guys want it to be coded itself. What we're seeing is that right now the major platform that's being used for these types of deployments is a platform called Ushahidi, which started off as one of the... Code it, I guess the difference would be that, what's the difference between code it yourself and open source? The difference would be you wouldn't necessarily publish the source online. It's like, you build your web app. Actually, going back, could I get a couple of people to tell me why they picked a certain option? Let's just jump back. Oh, that's a good one. So you said theoretically the open source people will have thought about, we'll have some people that think about web app security. Excellent point. How about someone from the bad guys? Come on, bad guys, are you here in the glasses? Great, yeah, so if you code it yourself, maybe you don't have somebody who can detect the security vulnerabilities in the code. Gentleman in the back. Okay, you want to go with the open source app because people already trust it and they'll be going with that.
Also, it's harder to get malicious code into an open source project because there's a lot of eyes looking at it. So if you get some malicious in there, it's only fighting to catch it pretty quickly.
Okay, so the idea is that if you can get, it's harder to get malicious code into an open source application. Now, to that I will say that the reason we don't have a live app happening right now is because there's an awesome JavaScript vulnerability in one of the main, and the image would have been Ushahidi. Yes? Yeah. Okay.
It's going to be quicker. You're going to be able to exploit the open source app quicker than you can exploit the code itself.
Yeah, so you're going to be able to exploit the open source app quicker than the thing that you code it yourself. You'll be able to go through and you'll be able to go and find the code. Okay, so let's just move on real quick. So what we're dealing with Ushahidi in this case is it started off as a project that was completely coded itself. It was written up in .NET in 2008 to deal with election monitoring for one of the Kenyan elections. And then it started getting momentum, and it's turned into an open source project that's written in a PHP framework called Kohana and runs on a MySQL database. So it's your typical, MySQL PHP type web application that's fairly easy to download and install, and as a result is being used everywhere. The thing that I like about working with Ushahidi, and I've done a lot of work with it, is that it is adaptable. It really is one of those classic uses cases for open source, where people say like, oh, you could jump into the code and you can modify it, and you absolutely can. And there are situations during these deployments where that's absolutely necessary. Things like Sudan, where we find a bug that crashes the system. We're able to jump in and edit that really, really quickly. We're also able to add new capabilities and new functionalities as response organizations request them from us. As they say, oh, hey, it'd be really great if we could get the data in such and such format because it's the standard format that we use. Then we're able to use that same code at next week's disaster. We already have it written. The downside with that is code vulnerabilities. And there's been a number of really funny ones in Ushahidi. One of the concepts in Ushahidi is that you can, when you submit a report to to the platform, it has to get moderator approval before it is visible to the outside world. Unless you go directly to that report's URL, and they're all sequentially numbered by ID. Or you go to the reports listing field, where it was showing unapproved reports. Or you go to the search system and search for and the unapproved reports would show up in the search results. And that's silly and it's bad, and it's an example of just not thinking about security. The thing that made it really, really bothersome is that we came up with the direct URL access vulnerability. We found that prior to one of the Egyptian deployments. We found the reports listing bug in, I think, the Sudan deployment, and we found the search bug during the Libya crisis map deployment. So this isn't the sort of case where people find it in a situation like, oh, we're in between releases. We find them during actual deployments, during these types of situations. So for Libya in particular, we knew that we were dealing with a situation where we had a very buggy code base. We were dealing with sensitive information. And so when we initially launched the site at the request of the United Nations, we just had the one on the right. It was a password-protected site that no one knew about. And we didn't make it public. So everything was behind a password. We had some basis of cutting down our attack surface. And then the response organizations had to contact the United Nations to get access to it. So the UN would handle who should get access to it and who should not. 2 weeks in, though, the UN said, hey, this is going really, really well. We really like this. There's a lot of really great stuff here. Let's make it public. And so we had, at that point, a huge amount of information that was being culled partly from social media, partly from media requests, and then we'd begun to start getting people who were working on the platform who knew people inside of Libya and had them contacting the site directly and sending information and saying, hey, I'm here, this is what's happening. So you're getting kind of the equivalent of SMS type of communications directly from people. So what we did to try to deal with that is, again, we had this concept of isolation of operations, but this time at the system level. So we split up the usage of the platform. So there was the private site where the NGOs and the people that knew about it could access it. That was still password protected. And then when we launched and announced, and it was on CNN, the LibyaCrisisMap.net deployment, that was a public site that had no useful information on it. Because as we did the migration from the private site to the public site, we stripped out all the descriptions, all the analysis that was being done by the people behind the scenes. We removed everything that could be potentially identifiable for a person, so we stripped out links to Twitter, et cetera, and pulled out the information that could be potentially useful for the bad guys. And what that also let us do was separate the public-facing hack this type of site from the private side of that ideally people didn't know about, and then bounce everything through GitHub. So for platform considerations, we've got things like new threats. We need to be able to adapt to those very quickly. And so we're dealing with, we have things like source access, ideally helpful authors, people that can help out, and being able to reuse the code that we'd made in previous deployments. And then for code vulnerabilities, we've got all the stuff that should be happening, things like best practices, code vetting, et cetera, which currently isn't being done right now, or it's being done on a very ad hoc basis. And then since we don't have a trustworthy code base, what we're doing is we're isolating the operations in some of these deployments. So there is some type of blocking the attack surface and ideally diverting the attacks towards a public type of site. Does anybody have any comments or questions about that? About the platform considerations and things about where we're going to be putting it? So the comment is it may not be better to code it yourself versus kludging it together from the existing services. And you might be right. What we found, though, is that we need a couple of things. First, we need something that's easy for people to interact with, because while it's easy for us to put together, there are a lot of people that aren't technical that have to interact with it. Secondly, we need to have, we're doing it more like kludging together like the library level, so the library that pulls in Google Maps and the library that does the geolocation. And because we have wrappers around that, we can get it to do exactly what we want, as opposed to having to deal with other services. And then there's also this concept that maybe the public services, maybe the professional services have better security around them and have actually thought a little bit harder about that. But that might be the case, but I've also found plenty of vulnerabilities in commercial software before. So it's an excellent point. And right now what we're seeing is it gives us a bit more flexibility to go with the kludging or with the open source projects, for better or for worse. On the right. Actually, yeah, guy on the right. My right. Yeah, that's you. Excellent point. Yeah, that goes back to that Moxie's trust agility thing. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to maybe mention it, but where the site gets hosted is going to have a significant factor.
Absolutely. So speaking of that, the next question is, where are we actually going to deploy this? Where are we going to put this? So your options are pretty straightforward. Local server directly on the ground, internet server, just something, a host that you purchased somewhere, or hosting it on like a cloud type of server. So good guys, bad guys. Question is, who wants to host it on a local server? Right. Who wants to host it on an internet server? And who wants to put it on the cloud? All right. So bad guys want it local, good guys want it on the cloud. Someone want to tell me why you want it on a local server?
Well, I want to mention that it actually doesn't matter if it's locally or it sees the server.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the cloud, they just go off internet access.
Good point. Somebody else from the bad guys? All right, how about from the good guys? Sir. Sure, sure, yeah. So you have local control. Got it. One more person from Bad Guys. Sorry, say that again.
I would deploy on all three.
Good point. Deploy on all three and have fault tolerance. Excellent, excellent point. So you're right. The first thing we have to worry about for local servers is direct attacks. Next, we have to worry about the internet being chopped off. You know, the bad guys and these governments have found out that the internet can have an off switch for their country. And so we can expect service interruptions. It's happening more and more frequently. The United Nations is going through and trying to put out a resolution saying that defining internet access as a fundamental human right in response to this sort of work. The big concern, though, so one of the approaches that we're looking at to deal with that, one of the other concerns is the idea of interception of messages. You know, we expect that in some of these situations, in some of these places, the cell phone network can already be compromised, and it's potentially moving towards a situation where the internet is easier and easier to manage, to infiltrate and to intercept. This is a report that came out from the Wall Street Journal talking about how people in the Middle East and governments are able to compromise Skype. Which is particularly concerning because right now Skype is the de facto standard communication tool for these deployments. Everyone meets in Skype chats, everyone communicates back and forth in Skype, and they do voice chats back and forth. It's what we were talking to people in Egypt with, et cetera. The main approach that we're working on for dealing with that is, like you said, deploying across all of them, the idea that we can do synchronization and anonymization. So in a situation where we're concerned about someone kicking down a door and just stealing a server, we can store sensitive information up in the cloud and then push it back down to the local group, similar to what we were doing in Libya, where we were separating out the information between two servers, except that we would potentially leave more information that would be actionable for the people on the ground, but potentially remove the user information, the things that could identify a person unless they were communicating back up. And sync those periodically, so even if the network connection goes down, if the internet is cut out, those people on the ground have still got access to it. So for platform location, we're worried about direct attacks, kicking down the door, taking the server, interruption of service, so the network goes away, and interception. And there are a variety of kind of standard tools that we've got for dealing with interception, encryption, anonymization, Tor, et cetera. One of the concerns, though, with things like Tor is you've got to have all your people who are going to be connecting to the platform using it ahead of time. And people that are submitting information have to know about it, which may not always be the case. If you're dealing with encryption, there was a really funny moment during the Libya deployment where we went out and we got an SSL certificate, and we're going to put SSL on the server. And as soon as we did, this site crashed. Resource-starved, completely, totally crashed. And it took a while to figure out what that was. And it turns out that in that latest version of the code, one of the developers had added a new security feature to the system that allows them to do SSL, which is strange because SSL is something you just don't need to worry about at the code level. But when we contacted him, he said, no, it works just fine. I've tested it a whole bunch of times using a self-signed certificate. And it was that problem when we actually used a real certificate that caused this really weird lookup loop that caused the thing to crash. So any comments? Any more comments about platform location? Yes?
But triangulation, you see a bunch of roaming SIMs in some parts of the country because you own the telephone network together.
Mm-hmm.
You can probably locate servers physically local, as well as, of course, the base of operation.
That's an excellent point, and we'll get to the actual cell phones themselves in a second here. Sir?
I think there's a lot more complexity behind platform location
Mhm.
than we have here.
Okay.
I mean, one of them is service delivery. Another one is operations on an ongoing basis. You get to update, access to that.
Absolutely.
As you mentioned, then there's the long-term storage of sensitive data.
Yep.
There might be another layer or another framework or another way of slicing and dicing this rather than the large platform location.
Yep, that's an excellent point, and it's definitely one of the things that we do deal with because these platforms are typically administered by a small team of people, and having the standards in place. The comment was there's a lot more to it than just the location of the platform. Things like, if I can get this right, who has access to contact it and to do the updates, storage of the location over time, storage of the sensitive information over time, and keeping the platform up to date over time. Is there anything else in?
Yeah, and by function, because there's also service delivery.
Yep.
Right?
Yep, absolutely. It's an excellent point. There's someone right behind him. Could you speak up a bit? That's an excellent point. Yeah, so having to deal with things like local laws. If you're dealing with a situation where you aren't allowed to use such and such a network, you can't use SSL or things like that, and those things are blocked. That's an excellent point. Anyone else? Yeah, so what we did for Sudan is we just swapped the IP address, and they didn't catch on and didn't update it. And so yeah, there's a lot of stuff that can be done around that. If you want to set up like fast flux DNS to actually keep these systems online. How about one more? So the comment is availability. So based on louder. Yeah, so you can't trust availability of other services like power, et cetera, because you're in a disaster zone. Yeah, that's absolutely true. There's another colleague of mine has done deployments like this in Afghanistan. And in addition to having to deal with power outages every now and then, one of the things that they weren't anticipating at first was everyone who was working on the platform having to stop for prayers periodically. So you have like the entire site just stopped as everyone went off and did prayers. So all excellent points. And so at this point, we've worked our way through this entire system. Who we are, what are we doing, and the last question is, in order to what? And my point is, there's a lot of different things that you can use this for. But regardless, we're still in just that tiny little dot. We've still just gone through and dealt with having to launch the platform. And there's a huge number of things we have to deal with the operationalization. Things like spreading the word, actually letting people know who's got access to this, who should be contacting it, who should be working with it. The options there is you can do it with no one. You can just passively collect the information that's coming out. You can you pass the word that this platform exists to a private network, similar to what we did with Libya, and similar to what's done in some of these the vote monitoring type of deployments. Or you can put it out to absolutely everyone. Let everyone in the whole world know that your platform is out there, that it's available, that you can use it. The first concern when we start messaging is the concept of misinterpretation. So people misinterpreting the message that comes out. And this is the equivalent of you calling up your doctor's office and them saying, if this is not an emergency, please dial 911. One of the potential problems that we're going to face is that if word goes out in these situations that there is a site, send your information here, people could potentially use that instead of something like the regular response channel. I was in Port-au-Prince when the New Zealand earthquake happened, and I was pulled into one of the conversations with the group on the ground, just an ad hoc group of people who were getting ready to launch this platform. And my one message to them before I got pulled away was that they should think very, 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 very hard before they release a shortcode to the world saying, hey, use this platform to do this, because it could interfere with the existing response process, the existing equivalent to 911. Are there any New Zealanders here? I can't remember what the 911 number is for New Zealand. So the first concern is misinterpretation. The other concern is message corruption. So we're spreading this message saying, hey, there's please send your information here so that it can be used and so help can be delivered. But what happens when people say that you can't trust that message because the site's been corrupted? This happened with another deployment in Sudan, not the one that I was responsible for and working on, where word hit Twitter that a particular Ushahidi deployment had been compromised by the Sudanese government, and you should not trust it because it's been hacked by the government. In this case, this was completely false. The message had come out by the people running the system, telling people in Sudan, do not contact us by SMS, do not contact us by email, we can't trust those systems. But by the time it hit Twitter, the word had changed to, OMG, it's been hacked. And this is a case where the message was corrupted inadvertently. There's also the potential for a very simple attack against these sorts of systems where the bad guys could just put out the message saying, oh, don't trust them. They've totally been compromised by the bad guys. So when we think about spreading the word, we have to worry about misinterpretation. We have to worry about corruption. Any comments on that? Yes? Excellent question. It's about how do you weight the trustworthiness of these sorts of things, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Anybody else? Sir?
So on the corruption and reestablish trust,
Absolutely. Yeah, so that's the question is, are people doing this ahead of time, trying to get out there and establish trust ahead of time? We call it getting ahead of the disaster. There are people that are doing it. So the Egyptian teams that are running the vote monitoring systems, they're reaching out to their people ahead of time. In terms of disasters, there hasn't been, to my knowledge, anybody that's setting one of these things up because the technology is still fairly new. There was somebody who had their hand up. Yep, great. So the question is, the government owns the SMS network. How can you trust it when they can turn it on and off? So there's a couple ways that's dealt with. One is using international SMS numbers. One of the ones that's used quite often is it's a company called Clickatel, where you can get numbers, and they have an API that's really useful, so you can just pull data directly from them. Another thing that's used is just using a phone that has an SMS to computer gateway. The Android app for Ushahidi has a system that will take any text message that comes in and push it back up to Ushahidi, so that gives you the ability to swap out by SIM cards. And so there are potential to do things like just move your cell phones around quite a bit. One more in the back. Yeah, you.
It's happened that a revolution will occur and the government will just bring down what the networks are for. You talked about internet before.
Yep.
When that happened, they started sending faxes like crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Technology sometimes way around.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So people using alternative transmission technologies, right? So and I think we'll mention that in the next section. But one of the coolest ones they did during Egypt was Google set up the speak to tweet system that allows people to call up and just read out what their message is over the phone, and then that was turned around and pushed out to Twitter. So things like that. There's also I saw for Libya they're doing like the internet in a box system, or internet in a suitcase, a little dropping it in, and then also the team in Libya that brought up their own cell phone network because they were able to reclaim chunks of the network. Excellent points. So yeah, this brings us to the next point, is the idea of message collection. So how are we going to receive these messages from people? You have the idea of direct messages. These are things coming directly from a person directly to your platform over SMS, over computers, email, et cetera. Then there's social media, which is our indirect type of messaging. And then there's the professional media. When we think about attribution, though, and the concerns about that is if it's coming from an SMS, a phone, you know where it's going. Very easy to do direct attribution. If we're dealing with social media, where at least something's coming kind of through a username that they've put out there, somebody has to find it and pull it down off the internet to actually figure out, oh, this person is talking about this particular thing. It can be a little bit more difficult unless they're pulling it off of a site that's doing that for them and making the information available. And then you've got the protected attribution from the main media organizations. Yeah, so the question is, this is what news sites are trying to do. Is there any interplay and overlap? Yeah, there definitely is. And that's a combination of people. One of the sources that will be pulled during these deployments are things from the news feeds. And the CNN is reporting this. The AP is reporting this, because those ideally have a higher level of trust. In terms of interacting with the actual reporters themselves as they're pulling the data in, I think there's a lot of opportunities for news organizations to be the ones to take the lead on this technology. Partly because it's already what they do. They already think in terms of information. They already have existing standards and best practices that they use for vetting information. And then what I see is happening is if the news organizations pick it up and begin to work on it and it becomes kind of a standard process for them, then that can be reach the tipping point where it's then picked up by the aid agencies who are not designed to think in terms of information. We have the exact same problems that we talked about before with service interruption, message interception. And so when we think about attribution interception, secure protocols, anonymous messaging, out-of-band communication, exactly what you said about people sending by fax, people sending by satellite. Things like interruption, if we're dealing with interruption, we've got multiple collection methods using those multiple media. Store and forward, this is something that we saw during Libya and some of these other disasters where the network did go down. When it came back up, we got floods of information. People were posting lots of stuff from YouTube that is kind of predated, before the internet was, or while the internet was down. And then finally, just expecting outages. I think that expecting things to go wrong, expecting that the network is going to get shut off, expecting that the cell phone network is going to get shut off is something that should just be built into all the standards and procedures because it happens regularly enough. And instead of being caught flat-footed when, for example, in Sudan, they stopped servicing Click-a-Tell numbers and we had to go and get one from somewhere else, that should be just part of the expectation for running these things. Anyone have a comment on that? Yes, and the white shirt. Yeah, so the comment is attribution in a natural disaster may not be that important, and you're absolutely right. I think that's definitely the case. One, on the flip side of that, though, one of the systems that was set up by a team at Google was a site called Person Finder, where people could list, we're missing this person, we found this person, et cetera. The concern there, though, is you get the opportunity for scammers to come in and say, oh, I know this person, I've seen this person, I can take you to this person. There are concerns with that. There's a lot of work being done on the Haiti data set because it is such a rich, useful data set for this system. Except that there is a process of anonymization that does need to take place because it does include people's names and phone numbers. And so there's a concern that if you put people's names and phone numbers out there, they're going to just start getting called by people on the internet saying, oh, hey, do you need help? Because I saw your phone number, which is going to drain their batteries, minutes, et cetera. So there is still a concern about public attribution, but I do agree that it's less of a concern in a disaster than a crisis. Sir. Yep. That's a great question. So when we do have misinterpretation, which is inevitable because people are in crisis under a lot of stress, playing that game of telephone, by the time it reaches the third person, it means something else entirely. Is there a way to feed back to people? Right now, there isn't. Right now, a lot of this stuff is very one way. And so there's a lot of work to be done on feeding back to people in a situation. And that can be things like, and I'll mention it in the microtasking system, if a message comes in and has useful information but no location, being able to feed back to them saying, hey, we'd love to work on this, but we don't know where you are. And right now, it's kind of an ad hoc process. Right, and then and then the other thought was pushing the information over to the 911 operators. Yeah, and in Haiti, the system did emerge to become something that was used by those response organizations. Like it was being pushed over to them as it came through that platform. One more? Okay, so the question was, we saw that Click-a-Tell, we weren't able to get Click-a-Tell set up in Sudan. Do we monitor the systems to detect when they stop working? That's sort of like the, we haven't received messages for the last 3 hours. Is that because the site is down? That is not something that is done. That's an excellent point. What happened in Sudan is that was announced ahead of time. Similarly in Egypt, they really locked down control of the SMS network, and they announced ahead of time that anyone that wanted to do mass SMS broadcasts, or I think even receipt, had to register with the government and jump through hoops. So they clamped that down ahead of time. But I will say that because people weren't expecting that to happen, it was very disruptive to the operations because they weren't anticipating it. All right, so I'm going to move on here real quick. So at this point, we've got the word out. We've got the people that are sending in messages. We're potentially receiving a huge flood of information, and we have to determine who's going to actually process this. And there are a couple of groups that are out there that can do that. You have your local groups. There's the beginning of a crisis mapping community that's doing this. You can just grab online volunteers, which is what was done in Haiti, or you can start using automated analysis. And we're beginning to have automated analysis tools, but they're still in the experimental stage. They're able to go through and categorize these things on the fly, but they still need to be trained. And so because of that, we're still in a position where we need to use people to process these messages. And right now, the standard for doing this is a giant shared Google spreadsheet, where all the information is taken in and put on a giant spreadsheet. All the volunteers who are working on it go through and they just process and do their little piece. And the crazy thing is it actually works for a workflow because it's something that everyone understands, and they can get in and they can work on it. And this is what's used by the Standby Task Force, which is the group that was running the Libya deployment. The problem with groups like the Standby Task Force is they're designed for only short-term type of deployments. And so after 2 weeks, in this case we extended to a month, we told the UN, hey, we can't run this anymore. Our people need to go back to work, need to go back to what they're doing. The UN said, hey, no problem. We'll just put the call out to the entire internet to see who else wants to help out on this thing. So we went from a small, close-knit group of people to the, hey, who wants to help on the internet? And so we're back to the infiltration problem. The idea that if anybody can join these things, anyone can get inside of it. I hesitate to show it, but there was a fantastic email that went out a week after this blog post to the Standby Task Force list. And it was entirely in bold, saying, everyone stop what you're doing, we're having security problems. And there were uses like bold and underline inside of this email talking about how things were starting to go wrong because of all these people that have just come in. Even though the people that decided that approved the UN volunteers had tried to do some basic work on like verifying that they had a Skype ID and looking at their Facebook page and looking at their Twitter feed so they weren't just completely random. But in this case, it wasn't the site getting hacked. It was just that because they were dealing with such an influx of people so suddenly, people weren't getting trained properly. And as a result, people weren't going through the proper process of anonymizing things and sanitizing things as they were doing it. So it wasn't a compromise of the platform. It was just somebody screwing up. The way that we have to deal with that is microtasking, taking the workflow and splitting it up into distinct chunks. This is some prototype code that we're working on that lets us do that. So we have teams that would just do the filtering, teams that would do categorization, and teams that would do geolocation. The idea here is that we could then take and add an anonymization step up at the front that would be done by a small trusted group of people. And then those anonymized messages, as they work their way through the platform, could be acted on by people who have less trust and they're just doing their job. We did this, an exercise last week. There was an exercise that was done to replay some of the Haiti data that had been translated to English. So they went through, we had volunteers that were going through and doing each of these steps, doing the geolocation. Looked really good. They were able to geolocate a lot of these messages inside of Haiti, and it was really neat until you zoomed out and saw where else they thought these messages were coming in from. Because they were just taking the messages, slapping it into Google, and writing in whatever came back. So we have a lot of stuff in France, because there was a lot of overlap with the French names. My favorite one is the one in Alexandria, Alexandria, Egypt, because that means the volunteer who did it didn't realize that the funny scribbling above the names was Arabic for the towns that they were looking at. So we have to deal with inaccuracy. The solution to that is sophisticated crowdsourcing platforms. There are some professional groups out there that have built these systems that have additional processing on top of what's normally done to try to verify the data as it's coming through. So it can do things like corroborate the location, so multiple people have to agree that a particular place is where they say it is. You can build accuracy of the people as they go through by inserting known good data and seeing what they come back with. And they've got existing groups, so we have kind of pre-existing trust with the users. So here are options for message processing. I'm just going to jump through the last couple sets here. Last things we have to do is report verification. This is really hard. There is no easy answer for it. This is difficult for everyone, not just in these situations. We have situations like the gay girl in Damascus who turned out to be a white, presumably heterosexual male American living in Ireland, not a gay girl in Damascus, fooled the entire media, fooled the entire blogosphere. And again, the things that we have to deal with that, it comes back to this concept of corroboration, reputation, and history. So building up that same trust on the fly with our reporters. And then finally, after we've gone through the entire process, we've got the last step of actually presenting the information back to people. And then once the information is out of our hands, we have to deal with a couple of things. Misinterpretation. People saying, even though you've said that this is the case, by the time it gets repeated to the third or fourth person, it's something else entirely. Manipulation, something that's able to slip all the way through the process and people can use it to redirect the response activities, and utilization by the bad guys. So we've got all these bad things that could happen. The last question I want to ask the audience for both good guys and bad guys is, do you think this technology is worth it? So bad guys, do you want this technology in your revolution? Do you want people using it? Good guys, do you think that this could potentially be helpful and useful? Show of hands. That's really fascinating. So it's a split group. Both people agree. My opinion is yes, absolutely. Because even though there are really bad things that can happen, we have things that we can do about it. We have ways that we can potentially mitigate some of these vulnerabilities and some of these issues and take this stuff not only through a crisis but into the world beyond it. This is what has resulted from the Haiti deployment. It's now a system that is online, run entirely by Haitians, and is used to track all sorts of things happening around the country. They have a deployment right now dealing with the cholera epidemic. So it's become an established part of the community, an established part of the response. So ideally, when the next disaster happens, it's already there and people are already familiar with it. Just to finish up, there are a couple of groups that do work in this area. At the top, the crisismappers.net, that's kind of the main mailing list for this group. It's where a lot of people from both the aid agencies and the community that are working on this hang out. The Standby Task Force is a group that's responsible for doing some of the response and handling some of these deployments, and that's where we're going to be kind of implementing this first set of standards and best practices. Crisis Commons is a group that kind of a large pool of volunteers. They tend to focus more on the hackathons, kind of daily, get people together for a weekend, try to work on something, kick out some new features. And then the open source projects, Ushahidi, the one we've been talking about. Sahana is a kind of a Swiss Army knife for disaster response organizations. Frontline SMS is one of the systems that's used to act as the SMS gateway, and that's used in a variety of different situations, including medical. They're using it in hospitals in rural Africa, et cetera. And OpenStreetMap is a really awesome project. It's kind of like the equivalent of Wikipedia meets Google Streets, Google Maps. Really, really cool project. That's everything I've got today. Thank you very much for your time.